Hello and welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. Blackout week continues. I think it's actually become Blackout Fortnight, which is 2 weeks if you don't know what a fortnight is. It's Blackout Fortnight here on the Power Hungry Podcast, where we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And today I'm pleased to introduce and welcome my friend John Harpole, the president of Mercator Energy. John, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast.
Robert, thank you very much. I'm proud to be in the lineup during this fortnight.
Well, I wish we didn't have a blackout, but here we are. So, John, and Mercator Energy is a Denver-based gas marketing company. You're the president of Mercator. You know that on this podcast, I ask guests to introduce themselves. So if you don't mind, who are you and why are you here?
I'll give you the 45-second update. So technically, Mercator Energy is not a gas marketer. We're a natural gas broker, where we never take title to gas. We provide outsourced services to industrial plants to show them how to buy natural gas. And then we track the gas through the pipeline system. And we help producers sell their natural gas to what we consider to be the highest priced market for their gas. So we really represent both industrial plants and producers anywhere from Louisiana to California. We manage about 2 billion cubic feet of gas per day. I kind of broke into this side of the business when natural gas was first deregulated back in 1985. I worked for an oil and gas company that was owned by General Electric. And there were 3 of us that were put in charge of trying to buy natural gas for GE facilities across the US so that those GE facilities in this deregulated world wouldn't have to buy from their utilities. And so to give you an idea, just from 87 to 90, I was traveling about 150,000 miles a year, meeting with utilities, meeting with interstate pipelines, meeting with gas suppliers to find supply for all those GE facilities. So in essence, what we're doing now at Mercator and have been doing for 27 years is very akin to what I started in 1987.
So you've been doing this now for, is that 38 years? Is that right? Something like that?
You know, I looked at each and I watched each of your podcasts, and evidently you're on the 40-year, the 4-decade cycle with your speakers this week, because
it has been about that.
I'm so old, Robert, that when I was a kid, you actually had to win something to get a trophy. So,
so you've been doing this for more than 3 decades. So
yes,
a relative rookie compared to the other guests on the Blackout week, but we'll welcome you anyway. Okay, so let's cut to the chase. The reason I wanted to have you on, John, was that you know the natural gas business as well as anyone that I know. And natural gas is now particularly in the limelight in the blackouts for obvious reasons, that gas was the key form of generation fuel during the blackouts and still is in Texas now, even in slack times. So we discussed, I want to get to the issue of liquidity right away, because this is where it seems that the state is on the verge of or has already begun a daisy chain of bankruptcies that started on Monday with the Brazos Electric Cooperative bankruptcy. What's happening in the market where between generators, natural gas suppliers, and ERCOT? What is happening? Are we on the verge of cascading bankruptcies? What's going on?
I believe so. And I think, you're supposed to remember the key date of December 2nd, 2001. You wrote a book about it. But years and years and years ago, when Enron declared bankruptcy, all of the traders or counterparties to Enron were in trouble because your biggest counterparty had disappeared, and you owed, in the case of producers, you owed producers money. And so the meltdown is kind of historic, and it's directly blamed on the mismanagement by the Texas Public Utility Commission and by ERCOT, in my opinion, because they didn't recognize the market for what it was during the course of this catastrophe, this disaster, and that inability to understand what was going on created now what we see as a financial catastrophe. In the Brazos Chapter 11 filing that was filed, 2 days ago, one of their top employees indicated that the cost to the wholesale market in Texas was roughly $55 billion. Now imagine $55 billion, it's hard to get your hands or your head around that, but that in essence, because the Texas Public Utility Commission stepped in early Monday morning, and this is President's Day, the day after Valentine's Day, they stepped in and said, hey, our $1,200 megawatt hour price is not accurate, so we're going to inflate this to incent gas-fired generators or any generators to come to the market and present us with electricity. So they took it from $1,200 and fixed it, stepped away from the market, said we're smarter than the market, and fixed it at $9,000 a megawatt hour. And that price lasted for 5 days. So the wholesale market incurred $55 billion of costs that were, in my opinion, inflated. There was no reaction.
And that's $55 billion for the electricity that was delivered
for 7 days
in the ERCOT market that ERCOT then set that price. And so now that's why we're seeing these bankruptcies, is because, well, Brazos said, well, we owe 1.8 billion. We can't pay. Is that right?
That's correct. So imagine Brazos was just $1.8 billion of that $55 billion story. And so this story, as you know, is going to unfold both on the electric and gas side over the next month and a half in terms of the ability to collect from somebody that owes you, or the complete inability to operate because this is the tip of the iceberg, Robert. I'm very concerned. And, I lived through that Enron bankruptcy back in 2001. The natural gas industry reacted by closely watching letters of credit and credit issues with counterparties. But when you squeeze 4 years of electricity value into 7 days, if you're even a little out of whack with your balanced budget with your counterparties, it's exacerbated by those numbers. I mean, in essence, just to explain on the natural gas side, we traded gas at the first of the month at the Waha Hub for $3.
And now we're talking about,
we're talking about
1,000 cubic feet of gas, or a million BTUs of gas, and Waha is a key trading hub in West Texas.
So to give you an idea of scale, so that's the amount of gas it would take to fill a room 10 by 10 by 10. And the average house in Colorado might use 2,000 cubic feet of gas in a cold winter month, okay? So we're trading gas, the price is about $3 a unit. Well, on the 12th, and I think it was Thursday, the 11th, we recognized that an incredible Arctic front was going to hit Texas. And we were trading gas Thursday and Friday for Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. We don't work on 3-day weekends. You don't trade. The Intercontinental Exchange is not open on holidays. And so this incredible
Intercontinental Exchange, just to be clear, that's where a lot of commodities are traded. Yes. Natural gas in particular, it's akin to the New York Stock Exchange, except for the natural gas business.
And the acronym is ICE. So ICE was not trading on Monday because they didn't trade on Monday.
It was President's Day.
Yeah. The prices that we worked on Friday were represented in a fixed price at every hub, every index price point across the country for Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday. Okay. And so the Waha hub, I think, traded as high as, let's say, $150 a unit. So we knew that this was the likes of which we've not seen before in terms of demand for natural gas. And remember, natural gas fills two purposes. It's there for home heating, but also for gas-fired electric generation for electricity. And so this, I guess, rather than point fingers at the other generation resources, those generation resources behaved as they were expected to behave. Wind was down 93%. And I could go in depth into that story.
It's based on its capacity, overall capacity.
From February 8th through February 16th, but the ERCOT recognizes the capacity factor that some of your prior speakers this week, the capacity factor, the availability of wind on a peak day is in the percentage-wise in the single digits.
Right.
Okay. Natural gas ramped up 450% in those days between February 8th and February 16th. Coal was there, just dead steady. Coal ramped up 47%. So again,
nuclear dropped a little bit. But it stayed at even at its lowest at something like 73%, so the high 70%.
I think one intake valve at a nuclear plant froze, the water intake valve froze, but it was quickly corrected.
Let me interrupt for just a second, John, because I want to be clear about this $50 billion number. And I actually had a piece in Forbes recently when I said, oh, well, that number's probably too high. Now, there's no definitive number, but I mean, as you say, the Brazos Electric Cooperative in the affidavit from Clifton Carney, one of their top managers, put that number at 55 billion. So for perspective, annual revenue of the electric sector in the U.S. is $400 billion a year, not for a week, for a year. And in 2020, electricity sales in Texas were about 35 billion. So, in a 7-day time span, or even really a 5-day time span, we saw Texas, in theory anyway, and this is the part where that the value of the electricity supplied in that week was almost 1.5 times, roughly 1.5 times the entire annual sales of electricity in the state. So, I mean, but to jump back, because I don't want to get too far into the the hub basing pricing and so on, but it's about, well, where did the money go? And now why are who's gonna declare bankruptcy next? Let's start with that one. Who are the most vulnerable players in the market now?
Well, let's start with two things, and you've identified this through your prior speakers, but as you know, Texas is an energy-only market, and paradoxically, it rewards scarcity. So the more they need electricity, the higher the price goes, and that's why they tried to set the price at $9,000 a kilowatt hour, basically to clear the market to provide as much electric generation as they needed, totally misunderstanding that there was a fundamental issue with gas freeze-offs and electricity that was not being delivered to gas producers to power their compression or the processing plants to deliver that gas into the interstate and intrastate market. And so to answer your question, who made the money?
And I want to come back to that issue of the electricity supply for the natural gas pumpers, because that's, that part of it seems to be a mistake of really just catastrophic proportions. But just, I want to make sure we just hit on that point. Who's most vulnerable now? We've seen Brazos Electric get out in front of this, and RWE, the big German firm, just yesterday announced they were facing losses of $400 million. The city of San Antonio said they're upside down by $1 billion. We're looking at, and ERCOT has already said they're short about 2.1. We're looking at $5 or $6 billion already, and we're only in the middle of the week.
Well, I'll answer that in 3 different ways if I can.
Sure.
The people that I'm most concerned about, and generally you ask for a call out. My call out on this podcast is I want people to understand that what happened in Texas should be considered an inflection point, even though something very similar happened in 2011, but should be considered an inflection point. And we should understand that all of these fuels are passed through to the ratepayer, to the residential, commercial, industrial ratepayer behind a utility. And so the individuals that are going to be the most impacted by this are the low-income households. They historically pay a disproportionate amount of their income to just provide heat and electricity for their households. And so I'm most concerned about these choices that are being made in the climate debate that are impacting low-income households. A household that, I got to tell you, I grew up in a low-income household, didn't realize it at the time, but my mom used to save her utility bills trying to anticipate what next month's utility might be like. And Robert, when you look back on it, it was never more than $60 a month. Some of these low-income households are going to be presented with a utility bill in the next month for natural gas that is 6 times to 8 times what it typically is for 1 month in the winter. So those are the people that I'm most concerned about. Now, who made the money? Anybody that performed in this energy-only market made the money. And so believe me, there are some gas-fired generators that made a lot of money. There are some producers who were selling gas based on a daily price and not a price established at the first of the month that was only $3. If they by chance decided, hey, I'm going to sell gas on a daily price, they won a huge advantage over those 5 or 6 days. The reality is, though, I don't know.
And they were able to sell on the spot market.
They were selling on the spot market. But believe me, nobody in the oil and gas industry that I'm friends with is celebrating what happened during this market, because it shakes the foundation of the market that we've been involved in for years and years.
So then this disruption, you're based in Denver, you're a Colorado guy, have been your whole life, but is it fair to say then this cascading series of events, now we had the blizzard, the blackouts, the people that, suffered, and some of them died, but now we're in the aftermath of this, and we're going to see bankruptcies and defaults. But is this going to have impacts throughout the natural gas sector across the country?
Yes, it reverberated beyond the boundaries of ERCOT. To give you an idea. So, and again, it's hard to differentiate how much of this was related to heating load demand and pricing, but still we saw higher prices on Thursday, Friday, then obviously Saturday, Sunday, Monday, and Tuesday than we'd ever historically seen. And I really believe that's because the market in Texas was calling through this spider web of interstate and intrastate pipelines for all the gas that it could get for heating load and electric generation load. And so one of the things that we study at Mercator is the capacity usage of a pipeline. Well, there was no pipeline in Texas that was ready or had been built in anticipation of this kind of demand, simultaneous demand for electric generation fuel and for heating load. But we had seen something like this before in what's called the Groundhog Day Disaster in 2011, that, there have been study after study after study that pointed out specifically, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, that, when you shed load as a utility or as a generator operator, as ERCOT is, when you turn off load or turn off demand, you got to be careful you don't turn off demand to the natural gas fields and the compressors in those fields and the processing plants that take that gas and move it into the market so you can fire up more electric generation with natural gas. And if you listen,
so let me interrupt here, because I just want to make this point here, that what you're saying, and this has been reported, but that ERCOT controls the generation, and then it controlled where the blackouts occurred throughout the state. So they were looking at areas where they knew they had lots of load, and that was one reason why they cut off big sections in Austin, big sections of Houston, at Dallas, et cetera. But what you're saying is that ERCOT also cut off some of the key gas delivery infrastructure that was needed to keep the gas flowing to the electricity generators. Is that fair? Is that right?
that's correct. And, two of your earlier podcast interviewees, Lee Cordner and Steve Brick, did a tremendous job about how critical it is to balance the 60 hertz power on the electric generation. So ERCOT has to make instantaneous decisions. They had 4 minutes, I think, before they had this potential total blackout. And their decision was, all right, we've got to cut off different areas of demand. Well, the same thing happened back in 2011 on February 1st to the 4th, where ERCOT had to shed load equal to 4,000 megawatts. And in the analysis, in the 380-page analysis that was presented by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission and the North American Energy Reliability Corporation, they said, look, hey, you guys, this is again 10 years ago, almost to the day. You turned off power to compression in the field, electric power, that meant you couldn't move gas from the wellhead to a processing plant. You turned off power to processing plants, to the motherboard that operates this natural gas processing plant, so they had to shut it down. And what I've heard, I've got many friends in the pipeline industry, but I talked to a couple different pipelines that have huge business in Texas that said, what happened is that you cut off electric power to the processing plant. Processing plant couldn't operate. That backed up the flow of natural gas all the way to the wellhead. And if you want to freeze off natural gas, keep it from moving. So it sat in the gathering system, sat near the compressors, and froze off, decreasing the deliverability. Even though the natural gas industry had peak deliverability as measured against any summer peak, there was still a lot of natural gas frozen off because of these electric disruptions that, quite frankly, for me, is the highest indicator of gross mismanagement at both the Texas Public Utility Commission and ERCOT. There should have been better communication and better identifiers. And hey, we don't want to cut off this producing field in the Permian Basin, because that's like shooting yourself in the foot.
So this was,
Self-inflicted.
a lot of failures here. There were a lot of failures in the way the market was designed, but during those moments when ERCOT was looking to cut load, they made a strategic error, and what is clearly now a self-inflicted wound that made the problem worse.
Well, we both went to CU Boulder, and there's a great saying over CU Norland Library that said, he who knows only his own generation remains always a child. ERCOT didn't even know its own generation. This just happened 10 years ago. You'd think that they'd be aware of this kind of situation going into it. And you'd think they would have communicated over the last 10 years with all the gas-fired processing plants, the gas-fired generators, to say, hey, in the worst case basis, what should we not cut off? And they didn't. And so it's, I can't think of a stronger word than gross mismanagement, but the testimony that was given by, 3 of the gas-fired generators before that marathon session in front of the Texas legislature earlier this week, both Calpine, NRG, and Vistra, which is called Luminant, all said, hey, some of our critical gas supply was lost because of electric cuts. Number one issue on the gas side.
So there's in the immediate aftermath of the blizzard, there was a lot of press, a lot of it. I mean, a stunning amount, frankly. And I've been watching this business for a long time. Oh, don't blame the wind business. Wind didn't just as expected. Nobody was expecting wind to perform. The real problem was the gas business. Is this vilification of the natural gas sector justified?
I think it's completely displaced. And I know, and I love your lines, but I think
Misplaced?
just completely misplaced.
Yeah.
Yes. One of your lines was that you thought the American Wind Energy Association had all the press on speed dial.
Apparently they did.
It's really, I kind of liken, and again, for those people that are watching this right now, go back and listen to the prior podcast. You'll increase your energy IQ exponentially. I think on Steve Bricks and Lee Cordner's, I took 10 pages of notes. But I mean, what happened here was avoidable. It was identified as an issue on the gas side 10 years ago. But the reality is, as you pointed out, the wind industry has kind of landed on a soft pillow. And I kind of look at the natural gas industry as Cinderella, with the stepsisters getting all the attention, $36 billion worth of attention. And for me, for a person that doesn't have the time to understand this system, as your typical residential customer of electric and gas in Texas, you would think that the inordinate amount of attention and money spent on wind would result in it showing up when you need it the most. And quite frankly, it doesn't. As you know, it's not dispatchable. Wind can only be turned down and off, and it cannot be called on when most needed. And I think it underscores, and I'm sure we'll talk about it more, this incredible concern that I've got right now that, look, the 2011 crisis wasn't a wake-up call for protecting this very beautiful machine that we have in the electric grid. Will this now be a wake-up call for people to really start talking about, hey, do we want someone that doesn't even tinker with their toaster to try to fix it, deciding how the electric grid should run from a regulatory standpoint and from a generation resource? I'm very, very concerned about the future, Robert, in this world where you've got the Bill Gates saying, don't burn anything anytime, and we're going to switch completely to electricity. There's 45,000 miles of high power, high voltage transmission in Texas. To get the wind from West Texas to the population centers of Dallas, San Antonio, and Houston, as you know, the CREZ lines, as they're so affectionately known, they spent $8 billion to make sure that wind had the deliverability, even though that deliverability doesn't happen on a peak day. So when are the fossil fuel generators going to get some love,
Say that last part again, please.
When are the fossil fuel generators going to get some love?
Well, I would say that's a great question. The same with the nuclear sector, because the
Exactly.
Nuclear reactors perform better than any other form of generation during the critical periods. Well, so is this?
Let me interrupt. I'm a natural gas guy, but I believe wholly in this. If you want to decarbonize the electric grid, build nuclear. Nuclear is the answer for stability and reliability. And natural gas, I think, should come in on a peaking request. But the system that we're headed down, this will not be the last time, if we both live another 20 years, that we're talking about rolling blackouts. Guarantee it. It's not going to, if this was left up to engineers and not bureaucrats, everything would run fine. But unfortunately, the real people to blame in this situation are the Texas legislators that let this happen, the PUC for not understanding the critical need of reliability and resilience, and then ERCOT completely mismanaging the system, the game as it was sent to them, to operate.
And that mismanagement was critical during the moments when the verge was on, when the grid was on the verge of collapse, and that shutting off the wrong sections of the grid then exacerbated the problem.
And our sons, and I know they both play basketball, they would say that they choked. The pressure was on, and the horrible devastation, the impact on lives, the impact on the supply chain, the impact on water distribution. This natural gas, nuclear, coal should be considered absolute strategic resources to protect the resilience of this grid.
So then what? I want to save this question till later, but we've danced around it. What should have happened, or what needs to happen now? I know you've looked back at the 2011 report that was done after the blackouts, the rolling blackouts there. What should happen next?
I think we need to recognize in this energy only market of Texas, we need to recognize that that energy only market that again incents behavior that you don't necessarily want, and that's scarcity behavior. I think we need to recognize that capacity factor that's recognized by all the other grid operators in the country is a critical issue. There was
So,
no
but
sense.
capacity, but you said capacity factor, but you're talking really about dispatchable power, I guess, to put it another way.
Yeah,
That there has to be more focus and on that resilience and reliability, which means having resources of whatever kind that you can call on in a crisis.
there
Is that a fair way to put it?
absolutely. I'd say that ERCOT had no imagination for what might happen, nor did the Texas Public Utility Commission, even though they've had other incidences similar to this with respect to weather, perhaps not where the National Weather Service called, for freezing advisories in three of the bigger cities in Texas. But this thing happened before. And there were recommendations all over this 370-page report about, okay, we really need better communication between the natural gas producers and ERCOT, the natural gas gatherers and ERCOT, the natural gas fired generators in ERCOT to make sure that when ERCOT responds with what they call load shedding, they don't turn off power to these key suppliers of natural gas that supplies electricity. We've got to recognize that, hey, this storm may come in and the dual purpose desire, need for natural gas for heating load and for electric load is critical. But Robert, I've been working this business for 30 years, and on the Friday before the Sunday outage, the Texas Railroad Commission issued an order, an emergency order, saying, hey, home heating comes first, and then electric generation comes second. Now that's standard operating procedure and has been for 20 years in every other area of the country. Of course, you don't want Mrs. Smith to freeze to death, down the street. Let's turn off everything else to make sure we have home heating needs. And I agree with that. But I mean, they had to present that on the Friday before. They put that little thought into all of this beforehand. Another stunning admissions. I mean, I guess there's no better way to understand a system than to watch it break and do the post-mortem on it, which again is each day I turn up something new that's like, I can't believe that these people in charge let this happen. But what was interesting, I pointed out to you last week, who apologized? Nobody apologized for this disorder. No one that I know has apologized. And that means to me that nobody's taken responsibility for this. Clearly,
Well,
that's why the PUC commissioner resigned, even
well,
before the
and that
legislature. She
right,
did.
and that's the part that to me is really frustrating, and it goes back to this issue of I want to get to deregulation here in a minute, but it's that in the wake of this, the buck doesn't stop anywhere, right? It's that no one is no. Well, it's I didn't create it. I'm just implementing the rules, and yet the I guess to go back to your point about the energy only market, the way I've thought about this is that the idea behind this deregulation of the electricity sector was, oh, well, it's just a commodity. Oh, we're just sell watt hours like we sell tortillas or hamburgers. And I've talked about this with other guests during blackout week, but no, you tinker with this incredibly complex network. That's the most important network in our society at your peril. And it's not a commodity, it's a service. And that takes me back to a point that was made to me by a former Enron pipeline guy who left Enron early on, before I think it even became, he was at Houston Pipeline. And he said, you can't just provide energy, you need to have capacity as well. In other words, you can't just say, oh, I'm just going to sell you, gasoline when when demand is low. No, you have to be prepared for that gasoline or tortilla chips or whatever it is that you're selling. If it's a critical commodity, you have to be able to provide capacity and lots of it at once. And that then he said, you have to pay for that. And that to me is it's torturing the analogy here a little bit, but that was the inability. It was the inability to provide peak demand during peak or energy and power during those times of peak demand, which was completely unanticipated. Is that, am I getting it about right?
More. I couldn't agree more. And one of the electric utility phrases that's so critical here is what was the reserve margin, which is ostensibly how much cushion did you have out there in terms of electric generation they could call on. And ERCOT going into this winter had the lowest reserve margin of any operator of a grid or independent system operator in the country. And so you'd think that if you're an energy only, you want to have maybe twice what other grid operators have in terms of backup, cushion of supply. And they didn't have it, nor did they, even after the recommendations of the 2011 outage, did they go in and harden and say, okay, I'm with the Texas Public Utility Commission. I really think that you guys need to make sure, ERCOT, that you don't turn off power to these gas generators, these gas producers, and these compression. One of the stories within a story, a disaster within the disaster, is that producers over the last 10 years have put in more electric compression in their fields to move gas from the wellhead to the processing plant to avoid EPA air permit issues. And so the percentage number of electric compressors powering that movement of gas from the wellhead to the market that was once 100% gas-fired compression is now a completely different number. And so there was a deeper impact. But I still want to step back.
So just let me, if you don't mind, I'll interrupt there. So the way the gas pipelines used to work is that the pipeline itself would use gas from the pipeline to power engines that would then fuel the compressor. So the system essentially ran on the fuel that was traveling inside of it. And instead now, because of air quality concerns, to meet EPA regulations, those pumps that used to use the fuel from inside the pipe were relying on electricity that was coming to them through wires. Is that accurate?
That's absolutely correct. And just the irony on top of ironies, in Colorado, if you do that, right now, 40% of the electricity comes from a coal-fired plant. So what are you really gaining in terms of avoided emissions by turning to electricity, other than you can point to the EPA, hey, I don't have that emission right here.
Well, and it goes to the key point, which is if you're going to produce energy, you need a lot of energy, and that energy has to be available. I remember, it was a book about coal, but it was, and I've seen it myself, right? That, in an underground coal mine, I was in Western Illinois, I think it was. And anyway, the coal mining machine was being powered by electricity that was coming from a coal-fired power plant, right? So that the idea of the coal was mining itself, right? Well, here you have a situation where gas would have been pumping itself in the pipeline, but now, because of those air quality regulations, it wasn't able to pump itself. It had to have an outside source of electricity that allowed it to pump the molecules.
And just to pick on wind for a moment, and you said this before, and it's again,
don't do that, John.
One of my favorite lines is wind, solar, renewables are terrific power resources until they're not. And there's been a disproportionate amount of incentives and mandates placed on the renewable sector, but with total disregard to that capacity factor or that peak day demand deliverability that clearly was the underlying problem with this rolling blackout that Texas experienced. And exacerbated by regulators that had no idea what was really going on and should have.
So why did San Antonio end up with a natural gas bill for $800 million? I know you're a natural gas guy, and we've been friends for a good while, but it's an impertinent question. Is price gouging happening here? Are they getting?
No, compare that to, I know that I sent you the 8K that Atmos Energy sent out for natural gas purchases.
And Atmos is a Dallas-based company that's a natural gas distributor. They provide city gas inside cities. They're a distributor inside cities.
And I'll just say, very, very well run. It has nothing to do with the fact that my niece works in the CFO's office there. But, I was constantly calling my niece to find out how they were doing. So Atmos issues on the Saturday of the event. Actually, it was the Sunday of the event, so it may have been Valentine's Day. They issued an 8K and indicated that they had to buy somewhere, and this is the amazing part of this story, somewhere between 2.5 billion and 3.5 billion of natural gas for their load. And that exceeded any other amount that they'd have to buy in any given year. And that was just gas for the supply that they purchased the week before. But imagine this, Robert, they couldn't even guess the number at that day within $1 billion. And so if you're a natural gas buyer for a utility, you don't buy just day of gas. You'll buy gas based on a 1-year price. You'll buy gas based on a monthly price. You'll buy gas based on a monthly average price. You'll buy gas related to storage so that you have resilience and reliability. And so any natural gas buyer like the one in San Antonio may have as many as 35, 100 different types of purchases going on from different suppliers for any given month.
To make sure that they're hedging their risk in terms
Exactly.
of delivery. And
Exactly.
we saw that in the Brazos documents when they're in their Chapter 11 filing, that they had a number of unsecured creditors that whom they own tens of millions of dollars now that look like they're not going to get paid.
Well, it's a very important point too for the gas utility. All utility commissions in each state allow that gas utility to pass through the cost. They don't earn a rate of return on the cost of that fuel. They pass that through to the residential ratepayers, but they earn a rate of return on the assets needed and required to deliver that natural gas from where they get it to the individual homeowners, commercial houses, commercial operators, that sort of thing. And so again, that cost that you identified in San Antonio, the cost that Admis identified, is all going to pass through to the ratepayer. And so Governor Abbott, in his wisdom on the Tuesday after all of this mess, said, look, and I think it was the Texas Railroad Public Utility Commission said, okay, guys, utilities, we're going to allow you to just put that cost of this huge climate event in a separate little box on your balance sheet, and you can charge that huge expense out over any amount of time that you want, next year, next 2 years. And we're not even going to force you to pay the interest rate. We'll let you earn a rate of return equal to the interest rate that you'd have to have that money on your books. And so each of these utilities knows that the world will come unglued if you send that residential ratepayer a bill for gas that is equal to 6 months worth of charges in 1 month. And this is a critical point also, though. You know, we talk about the dual use for natural gas. I can't find one natural gas utility that lost pressure and couldn't deliver natural gas for home heating purposes. So the natural gas industry met all the requirements for heating load. It's just some of the load for electric generation couldn't show up because the electricity was cut.
Well, you know, that's an interesting point. I know that I think there was some outage, some natural gas outages here in Austin in a portion of the city. And that's the only one that I've heard about. And there may be more. I'm not claiming that perfect knowledge on this, but there's an old saw in the utility business. It's easier to move molecules than it is electrons.
And it was easier to deregulate molecules than it was electrons.
And well, let's explore that, because that was the other thing that I wanted to get into, because the deregulation in the 70s, gas was very heavily regulated at the federal level, right? And there was very little interstate, correct me if I'm wrong, interstate transfer of gas, and there were price controls on that interstate movement of gas, and so that was one of the reasons why. Now, hindsight is always perfect, but after the price shocks of the mid 70s, the Carter administration said, oh, we're running out of gas. We don't have enough gas. And so we need to build more coal-fired power plants. And that was one of the effects of the electric, or the energy crises of the 70s, was this view that we were short, that the United States just couldn't produce any more natural gas, and therefore we needed to burn more coal. And so that led in the 80s to a construction of a whole bunch of coal-fired power plants. But then
let me interrupt if I can.
Yeah,
so
sure.
I really like to blame the Carter administration on this, because they completely misunderstood what was going on. They set up the Natural Gas Policy Act in 1978. I was a sophomore in college, and they set up the Fuel Use Act of 1978 that incented utilities to build very big, expensive coal-fired plants. And oh, and by the way, Robert Byrd was able to insert in that natural gas from the Fuel Use Act that all of the coal dust or refuse that happens after you burn coal is not considered a solid waste. Okay. So a huge gift given to utilities to go out and say, okay, I'll go build a coal plant. And then years and years later, they began to understand, wait a minute, we have plenty of natural gas down in Texas, Louisiana, plenty of natural gas offshore. This is really an issue of, can that natural gas access the interstate markets? And so at that time, before deregulation that occurred in 1985, the natural gas pipelines were really the only shipper on those pipeline was the interstate pipeline or perhaps a utility.
So
And so
there was
what they
no,
did is
so
they unbundled and unregulated that and said, okay, anybody that wants to, Robert Bryce and John Harpole can jump out, and if they have credit, they can go out and buy capacity on that pipeline. And that's in essence what we were doing for General Electric back in the late 1980s.
So the Power Plant and Industrial Fuel Use Act 1978 effectively banned or effectively prohibited the use of natural gas for electricity generation as well, right? That was
They
one of
set
the
up, the
other.
Natural Gas Policy Act set up about 27 different tiers of natural gas. They said, look, if you're drilling for tight gas in a deep formation in the Rockies, we're going to give you $17 an MMBTU. But if you're drilling for some of this easy stuff down on the Gulf Coast offshore, we'll give you $5. And none of that regulated pricing ever proved out. And so it got so expensive for utilities, they said, hey, I'm going to switch to fuel oil. I'm not going to abide by these commitments I had to buy natural gas. And so that's when the whole market that was set up under the Carter administration started to unravel.
So then we get to the mid '80s, and Ken Lay at Enron was one of the drivers of this. He was had a was in the Reagan administration for a short time, but in any case, in the mid '80s, late '80s, then we saw deregulation of gas. How important was the deregulation of gas then to the push for deregulation of the electricity markets? Or, if another way to put it, could Texas have deregulated its electricity sector without deregulated natural gas?
No, they could not have.
Why not?
Well, think about this. So again, I lived through that deregulation of the natural gas market. How do you get natural gas to a gas-fired generator and then transmit it in open access transmission lines in Texas unless you've already deregulated the gas side first? Gas, let me give you an idea. So we see electricity traded in 5-minute increments. I have 4 chances a day to correct the volume that one of my producers says they're producing over a 24-hour period. And then the day after, I can even correct it also.
So you have
And
a
so,
6-hour window instead of a 5-minute window.
oh, no, I've got a 24-hour window in essence to correct the volume of gas that's flowing, and I don't have 5 minutes. And so, again, to your friend who said it's a lot easier to deregulate molecules than it is electrons.
Move molecules.
Yeah, it's easier to deregulate it also. It's just a function of the market. So in order to have access to molecules of gas, you had to first deregulate that natural gas market so that not only the utilities controlled the flow of that gas, but individual companies could. So it was an absolute precursor to deregulating electricity. That FERC order, sorry to get jargon on you here, but the FERC order to deregulate electricity happened in 1996. FERC order 888. We did have some other Public Utility Resource Policy Act that kind of was a precursor to that deregulation. But I think the lesson for ERCOT here is you can certainly deregulate, you can certainly set up your own system that's an energy only system, but you need to have a higher reserve margin, and you need to harden some of these facilities and educate everyone that natural gas during those peak day demand time periods is probably the best answer in terms of its ability to get there, in terms of its dispatchability.
Well, and dispatchability, but also that surge capacity, right? I think before we started talking, you gave me some numbers regarding, and I published a piece. In fact, I published it in Forbes when I was blacked out. But it was the ability of gas to provide a big surge of energy during the cold winter months. So what was the increased gas consumption in Texas over the time during the blizzard time period compared to usual daily consumption in Texas?
So I can give it to you. The consumption was probably about, on electric generation, not heating load, was probably about 2 BCF a day, prior to the outage. And then it ramped up to 22 BCF a day to provide electric generation. So, some people call it a 480% increase in gas over that time period, or 450% increase. Robert, it was dramatic. You got to understand, you can turn on a gas-fired generator in 5 minutes with 5-minute notice. So as long as you can get the fuel there, you can turn it on. And you can turn it on a combined cycle unit with 20 minutes notice. Very few of the other resources, certainly renewables can't do that, but coal and nuclear are built to run 24/7, 365. Gas has a unique ability to ramp up when called upon.
Or provide baseload. You can use it as baseload.
Or provide baseload, exactly.
It as nuclear or coal. But I want to make sure I get those numbers right. Did I hear you correctly? You saying gas went from an average of 2 BCF a day, which seems low for electric generation, to 22?
I heard on a megawatt side, I heard that gas was supplying about 3 megawatt hours. If you look at some of the curves that I've sent you that you've shared, it was supplying about three megawatt hours, and it ramped up to 35.
3 gigawatts into 35 gigawatts.
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I want to make sure we get our energy and power terms right here. But yeah, I think that sounds about right. That gas went from, Texas has about 100,000 megawatts, 100 gigawatts of installed capacity, and that, but not all of that was available. Of course, some of that's solar and the rest of it, but that gas ramped up dramatically, and during the times of peak demand, to over 30 gigawatts, something on that order. Is that?
So imagine that happened at the same time they're calling on for natural gas for heating load in numbers that Texas had never seen before.
Uh-huh. And did you have those numbers in terms of, because I know that we saw gas consumption nationally. Richard Meyer from the American Gas Association had documented as something on the order of 150 BCF a day during those coldest days. And so Texas generally is 10% of about everything in the United States. So that would have been 20 BCF a day in Texas alone.
So Bloomberg put out a note that yesterday that natural gas during the peak demand was supplying 22 BCF a day to the Texas, they call it the Gulf market. 22 billion cubic feet of gas per day. The peak last year, again, ERCOT's built for a summer peak for air conditioning load, but the peak during the AC load, the highest peak in the summer, last summer, was 17 BCF a day. So the ability for gas to respond against a peak day measurement was 5 BCF a day more than what it had ever been called on for. And you got to believe a big chunk of that was going to heating load requirements by cities like San Antonio and utilities like Atmos.
Sure. Well, and some of it was me. I mean, we had natural gas on our stove. We had a natural gas water heater and felt ourselves lucky. But so just to put that 22 BCF a day into context, average consumption in the United States now is on the order of 85 or 90 BCF a day, something like that.
It can go up to 100 BCF a day. Production is there, yes. So to answer your question, yes.
So everybody wants to point fingers of blame now, and we've already talked about that. It doesn't seem like the buck stops anywhere. So if I were to point you to the head of a commission, or, what are your top 3? We've talked about some of these things again, but I want to drive this point home because Texas really, it came so close to a complete blackout of the Texas grid, which the failure of that would have been truly catastrophic. We're talking earthquake kind of, or, killer tsunami, or, some other catastrophic event that we would have difficulty, atomic bomb, something else we'd have a difficulty comparing it to. So if I made you king and you had, your options, what would be the 3 things that you do right away to make sure this doesn't happen again? I want to make sure that I get these points down.
Well, this is a self-induced EMP bomb over Texas, electromagnetic pulse bomb that took out the grid, in essence. There's a guy, economist at the University of Houston, Ed Hears. I think you know Ed.
Sure.
He's been predicting the fragility of the grid and that ERCOT manages. He's been saying this is going to happen for 10 years.
Right.
And his greatest statement, and I've got to share it with you, is every time he hears this legislator calling for an investigation, and this is a great quote, he said, "No, you dumb bastard, you don't have to go any further than the bathroom mirror to figure it out." This falls squarely on the legislators that set up the game, told the Texas Public Utility Commission to implement this game with ERCOT. And so, number one, to blame, Texas legislature. Number two, Texas Public Utility Commission for acting more like an entity that's just worried about the rules and regulations rather than enforcement of, hey, let's go harden this grid. Let's go make sure that all the gas-fired generators are hardened. Step back parenthetically here. Your peak in Texas is always in the summer. So do you want your
peak electric demand?
Peak electricity demand. Do you want your natural gas-fired generator in a building that gets really hot? In a warehouse that gets really hot, or do you want it outside? Guess what? Most of them are outside. And so we see a new peak, and that peak occurs for demand for electricity in the winter, augmented by the demand for natural gas for heating load. And so the people I blame is the lack of imagination or understanding of how the system works. And I blame that squarely on the Texas legislature. You know, Robert, I was talking about this in Colorado 12 years ago. The renewables that get all of the attention are kind of like crack cocaine for a legislator, and they're hooked on it to the demise of the other generators that are so critical to this, what I would argue is a national security need for a reliable, resilient electric grid. I mean, this is a very complex machine, as one of your prior speakers said, that bureaucrats, not engineers, are tinkering with to placate the desires of so many of the climate change folks. Is that, hey, we can't burn anything anymore anywhere.
Because it's politically popular. Everyone likes solar and wind. These are very poll after poll shows how popular they are.
So
but in terms of concrete action, I'm going to keep after you on this. So what hardening delivery systems, including pipelines, getting them off of electricity on the pumps. What are the key things you would do right away?
Number one, make sure that ERCOT understands the priority of cuts when they're shedding load, that there are certain areas, production areas, that they should not shed loads. That a communication was called for, and I counted it last night in that 350-page report, at least 35 times in that 350-page report. I did a word search on the report, called for 35 times, and it clearly fell on deaf ears at ERCOT. Okay.
So number one, ERCOT has to be more careful or strategic in how it sheds load. Is that a fair way to say it?
Absolutely. Number one. And then the Texas Public Utility Commission needs to recognize that they're not just a regulatory authority with regard to rules and regulations, but enforcement of hardening the grid. When I say harden the grid, make sure that there are windbreaks out there near these natural gas fire generators. Make sure that those natural gas fire generators have backup power on site, maybe even diesel power to operate some of their facilities. Make sure the natural gas processing plants that rely on electric supply to run the electronic boards that run that processing facility, make sure that they have backup power so that electricity loss, even though ERCOT's supposed to understand what's going on in the future, make sure electricity loss isn't a devastation that it was in this grid. Let
me interrupt here, because I know you're saying this is what ERCOT needs to do, and then what PUC needs to do. But for them to do anything, they need the legislature to pass these measures, right?
I think, and here's the real dilemma. I think that the Texas Public Utility Commission has the authority to do this right now.
But they didn't use the authority.
They didn't use the authority. If you look at all the suggestions and recommendations made, and I've had this from friends who work at utilities, this Texas Public Utility Commission really thinks of itself like a regulatory body for the tariff, and that is the rules and regulations of how it should run. They've never inserted themselves in, okay, guys, we got to harden some of this generation, make sure it's there when we need it. You know, I would also pass a law in Texas saying we will not have any electric powered compression in the fields.
So that any compression in the pipelines would be dependent on the fuel in those systems themselves, and not
make that system redundant within itself. Absolutely.
Well, those are interesting ideas. And, to go back to one of the things that
there's one more, buddy.
Okay, sure. Go ahead.
Make sure that reserve margin is at least at least at 25% of the expected generation load in excess. That reserve, that cushion is 25% above minimum, above what you expect to need until you, quote unquote, harden the system from the wellhead all the way to the natural gas fired generator.
Those are all, I like those ideas. The one that sticks out there is this fuel on site issue. And it's one that Meredith Angwin, whose book, Shorting the Grid, has gotten a lot of attention. And she was very much ahead of the curve here. And after studying the grid for decades, and then put out this very timely book. But her point is that she calls it the fatal trifecta: too much reliance on renewables, too much reliance on just-in-time natural gas, and too much reliance on imports. And her solution is, well, don't rely on imports, don't rely on just-in-time. Make sure whatever it is, and this applies obviously to fuel oil or coal or nuclear plants, that you have significant capacity, that you don't need to get the fuel from somewhere else. And I think that
And
that's
I agreed with 99% of what Meredith said, but the notion that we have just-in-time natural gas is something I want to go into for a couple of minutes. Let's suppose you're Luminant, Vistra, and you have 10,000 megawatts of gas-fired generation capacity out there, okay?
Now, Luminant and Vistra are two different, they're not the same company, are they?
Luminant is owned by Vistra.
Oh, okay, all right.
So Luminant is the operating body with all the 13 gas-fired generators. They've got a coal plant.
I got you. Okay.
So imagine you're Vistra and you're bidding into this ERCOT market every 5 minutes, trying to come up with a solution that utilizes your natural gas-fired generation, okay? Well, in order to ensure that you have gas supply coming into that gas-fired generator, you have to buy some capacity on the pipeline that feeds that generator, okay? And so I just did a ballpark estimate of what the daily cost would be to ensure that you have pipeline capacity that's guaranteed to give it to you just in time. And the number, if it's 40 cents a unit or 40 cents a 1,000 cubic feet, it's about an $800,000 a day cost for Luminant to ensure that they have capacity, even though they may not use that capacity every day. So set that on a shelf, and then let's think about the wind generator. Because of the production tax credit of 2.3 cents a kilowatt, they can operate their system at a loss because they're still getting that production tax credit for 2.3 cents, okay? So this is how the game is rigged in favor of the wind energy when bidding into the grid. Robert, that 2.3 cents is worth $6.50 an MMBTU equivalent on the natural gas side.
So just to be clear, that production tax credit, which was just extended, in fact, in December, yes. And I wrote a piece about it, that that was not voted up or down on a separate, it was attached as a rider to this omnibus spending bill in December. The production tax credit, which extends its history back, I think, to 1991, continually extended, and without an up or down vote on that one issue by Congress. Instead, it's added. But the key here is that 2.3 cents per kilowatt hour, or $23 a megawatt hour, can be very, as a tax, and it's a tax credit, is very lucrative for the people who are able to use it. And you're saying, if I'm hearing you right, that tilts the playing field toward their favor to a degree that is excessive. Is that a fair statement?
It's a fair statement. I've tried to come up with an analogy, and I would say that ERCOT is playing Texas Hold'em while all the other independent system operators are playing Monopoly. They require certain performance. ERCOT is playing Texas Hold'em, and the wind energy and solar guys get to see everybody else's card, and everybody else has to ante in for the wind energy guys. That's how tilted the playing field is. So if I'm Luminant, why in the heck would I ever buy upstream capacity for $800,000 a day? Typically, that commitment is for 5 years. Why would I do that to ensure just-in-time delivery when I'm stacked? I've got a stacked deck against the wind energy guys. Now, set that aside for a second too, and let's say Luminant did, and I'm sure that they did own that capacity in the pipelines. Now you got a situation where they can't even get gas into that capacity because electricity has been cut off from the source that they fill that capacity with at the natural gas processing plant. And then if they do successfully, imagine this then too, if they do successfully get it to what we call the city gate, where the utility can take it or the electric generator can take it, the Railroad Commission says, oh, by the way, heating load takes precedent. So even though you invested all that money, we're going to take that for heating load and then compound that with, I heard somebody say that 50% of the electricity consumed, 50% of the homes are heated by electricity.
In Texas.
So it's just a problem compounded on a problem, compounded on a disaster, compounded on mismanagement. You know, I don't know how Luminant competes. They obviously do. They probably made a lot of money, as did NRG and Calpine when they were able to perform. But this is a system that incents scarcity the way they've got it set up at ERCOT. And that's not good for the ratepayer.
If I can interrupt there, because that's the part that I keep coming back to, is that the system was set up to reward crisis and scarcity instead of understanding that you need to provide electricity that is super reliable and as at low a cost as possible.
So imagine, buddy, imagine the discussion that went on at the Texas Public Utility Commission Sunday night, where they said, hey, we've got $1,200 a megawatt incentive for gas generators to come on. And they're not coming on. So you know what we're going to do? We're smarter than this market. We know they're just sitting there waiting to come on. The price scarcity signal has not been properly set. So you know what we're going to do? We're going to raise it from $1,200 a megawatt hour to $9,000. So they did. And in the next 30 hours, no additional electric generation showed up.
Well, and Bill
already maxed out.
And last week on the ERCOT urgent board meeting, he said that very thing, that no new capacity came online after the price went up.
And they were surprised. Does that tell you they didn't understand?
And they shouldn't have been surprised?
No. They didn't have a reserve margin. They didn't understand that they had to communicate to gas-fired generators that there was a need for gas, and so we can't turn off the electricity. I mean, this is an accident, a train wreck 20 years in the making. That they had a brief look at it 10 years ago to correct it, and Robert, they didn't correct it. And my worry is that this is an inflection point for this whole, it should be an inflection point for this whole discussion about how we keep our electricity grid running. But I'm worried that it's going to be ignored. And instead of people pointing the finger at the legislature and the Texas Public Utility Commission, they're going to say, oh my gosh, look at how much money Calpine made. I mean, I've even seen on Wind Energy Association websites, on blogs, that they're accusing the gas-fired generators for not bringing on capacity so that they would raise the price. And that's where the investigation will ride for those people that are wind energy, renewable energy advocates, is that the gas guys who have been beaten about like the stepsisters to Cinderella, or like Cinderella, didn't show up when they were supposed to.
Well, I think that's one of the key issues that we're going to have to grapple with, and it's part of this autopsy that's ongoing. And as I said, this autopsy is going to be gruesome, and we're already seeing how gruesome it can be. So, John, we've been talking about an hour, and I don't want to. I like to keep our podcast right about this length. You've given us some good recommendations on what should happen. Any other thoughts about, you and I have talked about this for now a couple of weeks, and it was one of the reasons why I wanted to have you on the podcast. Oh, and by the way, just a reminder, my guest is John Harpole, president of Mercator Energy, a Denver-based gas broker, who deals with gas supply and gas production and gas consumers across the country. And you don't have a call to action here. That was one of the things we didn't talk about. What should people who are listening to the podcast? I've had people on with books, and they go to their website. What if you have your druthers? What would you like people to do after hearing our discussion today?
And this is not a cheap plug for your prior podcast, but I want people to increase their energy IQ. Robert, I learned so much from your earlier speakers. Meredith, Lee Cordner, Steve Brick, Paul Oxer. People, please go listen to those earlier podcasts. You'll increase your energy IQ by a factor of 3. I know that I did with respect to a lot of issues, and I've been in the business for 40 years. But I want everybody to recognize that they've got to speak out on this issue. We need to understand the grace with which this electric grid is run. And we need to understand the impact that if we tinker with this thing and screw up, which is what happened, that the people most affected by this thing, by the pass through of these gas costs, will be these low income energy households who don't apparently have a say in the discussion about climate change. They're too busy trying to make money to live. So I'm most concerned about the disproportionate impact on households that pay a disproportionate amount of their income to heat and electrify their household, who quite honestly don't have the time to jump into the equation of discussion. So please, every viewer, every listener, go increase your energy IQ, keep listening to this blog, but really study this issue as the inflection point for many, many, many discussions to come.
Well, I think that's a good place to stop. I didn't ask you to plug the podcast, but I'm glad you did. You did as good a job as I could have. And the issue, I agree with you. I think that this is the there's just simply no doubt that the issue of energy burden, which is the term of art used by people who are in the field of looking at energy poverty, that this energy burden is going to increase dramatically on low and middle income consumers. And that should be a concern for everyone, and not just in Texas, but across the country, because I think that these, to mix the metaphors here, we're seeing a lot of these chickens coming home to roost, and these arguments about, deregulation is going to save consumers money. We're about to find out that was never true. And there are going to be some big bills paid in the very near future. So
Couldn't agree more, Robert. Just thank you for doing what you do.
Well, glad to do it, John. Thanks a million. My guest again has been John Harpole. He's the president of Mercator Energy. It's a Denver-based gas brokerage firm, mercatorenergy.com. Is that right, John?
Yes.
MercatorEnergy.com is his website. You can go and find more about him. John, many thanks for your time today. It's been great. Glad to, we've had many phone calls since the blackout, and I thought, well, who better to talk about this than you? And so I'm really pleased to have you on. To all of you in podcast land, thanks again for tuning in. My guest again has been John Harpole. I think, are going to have one more episode of Blackout Week here on the Power Hungry podcast. So stay tuned. Because this, as like John, I think this is an inflection point. I think this is going to be a telling event, and perhaps a pivotal event in terms of understanding the importance of electricity in our country and around the world. And it's long overdue. So thanks again for tuning in. Tune in next time for the Power Hungry podcast. Until then, I'm Robert Bryce, the host. See you next time.